Okay, chapter 14. Getting there, almost to the end of these chapters. This one is on health psychology, and that includes stress, coping, and well-being. And this chapter has 3 modules, and each of those modules deals with, each of these aspects. So we're going to talk about what stress is, what can cause stress. We'll talk about, different types of stress on our bodies, like cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease. We'll talk about smoking. We'll talk about cancer. And then we'll also talk about well-being and kind of like the healthcare system that goes along with all of this. So before we get into module 43, I had to check and see which module it was. I want to go over just 2 basic definitions of what we're going to cover in this chapter. So the first one is a definition for health psychology. It is the branch of psychology that investigates psychological factors that are related to wellness and illness. And this could include prevention, what you need to do to prevent these things, a diagnosis, and the treatment of medical problems. All of those are included in this broad umbrella of health psychology. The second definition is psychoneuroimmunology, which is also abbreviated PNI, much easier to say than psychoneuroimmunology. So this is the study of the relationship among 3 things: psychological factors, the immune system, and the brain. So you're taking all those aspects of health, we're tying it into your immune system, and then also seeing how the brain is related to those other 2. Okay, so let's start out with module 43, and this is on stress and coping. There are 2 questions that we are going to answer in this module. The first question is, how is health psychology a union between both medicine and psychology? Because stress definitely has a physiological aspect to it, which we'll talk about in this chapter, and then psychology kind of ties into that also with stress. And the second question we're going to answer in this module is, what is stress? How does stress affect us? And how is it that we can best cope with stress? All right, so let's first start out with how we react to threats and challenges, right? Because both of those things, both threats and challenges, can cause stress in your life. So first off, stress is how a person responds to events that are threatening or challenging. The stressors that we have are circumstances and events in our lives that produce threats to our well-being. So you have these stressors that produce stress. Your daily life is a repeated sequence of 3 different things: perceiving a threat, considering ways to cope with that threat, and then also adapting to the threat with greater or lesser success. So we face these things on a daily basis. So over time, you should get better at adapting to those daily stressors that you have. Your attempt to overcome stress can ultimately result in health problems. If you have a lot of stress in your life and you're constantly dealing with stressful events, that can take a toll on your well-being. It can take a toll on your body physically. And you may have realized this, if you are working a full-time job and are also a full-time student and you have a family, that continues day in and day out, that you have to deal with those 3 things. And after a while, it can take a toll on your body if you're not dealing with it in the most, productive way. I want to talk about the nature of these stressors. So again, a stressor was a circumstance and event in life that produces threats to our well-being. So I want to talk about the nature of the stressor. So my stress is your pleasure. There are certain kinds of events that are universally stressful. So that could be like families and jobs and the economy. Those are universally stressful to everyone. Other situations, however, may or may not be stressful to different kinds of people. What may be stressful to me may not be stressful at all to you. So you have certain stresses that are universal to everyone, but then you have other stressors that could just be individualized. To find an event stressful, you must perceive it as threatening or challenging, and it must lack all the resources to deal with it effectively. So your interpretation of an event is key in whether or not you see an event as stressful. This is figure 1 in your textbook, and this can be found at the bottom of page 464. And you can see it's looking at the coronavirus, right? We have all just lived through COVID-19. Some of us are still dealing with COVID-19. But this was done in 2020, and the coronavirus pandemic caused considerable stress and anxiety, as the results of this survey of college students clearly showed. So you have, stress or anxiety, disappointment or sadness, isolation, loneliness or isolation, financial setbacks, and relocation, and how much stress each of those have caused, or how you dealt with each situation. So this is really a recent study that was done just specifically dealing with the coronavirus. The next thing I want to talk about is how we categorize stressors. There are 3 different types of stressors that we may experience in our lives. The first one is a cataclysmic event. This is a very strong stressor that occurs suddenly, and typically it affects many people at one time. So an example would be a natural disaster. So something like a hurricane or a tornado, or, a large amount of snow. So a cataclysmic event is a very strong stressor that affects a large group of people all at the same time. Opposite of that is your second type of stressor, and that is a personal stressor. So this would be a major life event that has immediate negative consequences and generally fades over time. So this is definitely more individualized. And an example of a personal stressor is the death of a family member. This is not going to affect a whole entire community or a whole entire state or town of individuals. It's something that may be more geared just towards you personally. And then the third type of stressor are what we call background stressors. These are your daily hassles in your life. So it's an everyday annoyance, such as being stuck in traffic. And it can cause minor irritations, but can have long-term ill effects if it continues to compound by other stressful events. So if you deal with traffic on a daily basis when you're commuting to work, that is a daily stressor that you have. If you have to take your child to school every day and pick them up and take them to events and take them to sports and do all those things, those are daily stressors that you have in your life. The flip side, though, are the uplifts, things that come out that are good in your life. That can kind of lift you up as a way to deal with those daily background stressors. Figure 2 shows you some of the more common everyday stressors. And this is at the top of page 466 in your textbook. And this shows the more common everyday hassles. And you can think about as you read over these, how many of these are a part of your life and how is it that you cope with them? So along the x-axis, you have the percentage of people that are experiencing these stressors, and then along the y-axis, the daily stressors you have. So not enough time in a day to get things done, too many things to do, troubling thoughts about your future, too many interruptions when you're trying to get something done, misplacing or losing things, the health of a family member, a social obligation you may have, concerns about various standards, concerns about getting ahead, and then too many responsibilities. So you can see those last three are almost even, but not enough time to get things done in your life is experienced by many different people. It's probably almost at 90% of people deal with not having enough time to get things done with these daily stressors. Now, figure 2B is also right below the previous figure, still on page 466. And this shows you the various uplifts. So these are the more common everyday uplifts and the number of people who experience them. So relating well with a spouse or a lover, relating well with your friends, completing a task, feeling healthy, getting enough sleep, eating out, meeting responsibilities that you have, visiting, phoning, or writing someone, spending time with your family, and what pleases you, right? So that is like your home base. So even though you have those daily hassles, you also have these uplifts to kind of keep you going. Now, if we're still talking about categorizing stressors, what we find is that some members of racial and ethnic minority groups often experience high levels of personal stressors. Again, these are not cataclysmic events, and these are not daily hassles. These are personal stressors. And we find that individuals of certain racial and ethnic minority groups, they may experience high levels of these personal stressors. Now, if we do look at cataclysmic events, there are some victims and severe personal stressors that experience PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and we're going to talk about that later on in this chapter. Whenever we think about what post-traumatic stress disorder is it's a phenomenon in which victims of a major catastrophe or strong personal stressor feels the long-lasting effects of that. And this may include re-experiencing the traumatic event over and over again. You may have flashbacks back to the time when it occurred, or you may have dreams about that traumatic event. Post-traumatic stress disorder may be triggered by otherwise innocent stimuli. You know, what would occur in the environment would not cause a stressful situation in some individuals. However, if you have PTSD, this may trigger a very stressful situation for you. We find that PTSD is most commonly experienced by soldiers and victims of rape. And it occurs in response to terrorist attacks and mass shootings. So most experienced by soldiers, victims of rape, response to terrorist attacks, and mass shootings. So let's look at the high cost of stress. What does stress actually do to you? It comes at a very high cost. So stress produces both biological and psychological consequences. Whenever we talk about a psychological disorder, it is a medical problem that is influenced by an interaction of psychological, emotional, and physical difficulties. So stress may lead to a psychological disorder. Stress affects all of us in a multitude of different ways, and there are 3 ways that we have listed here on how stress can affect us. It can increase your risk of illness because it can take a toll on your body and it can affect your immune system. Stress can also hurt our ability to recover from diseases. And then third, it reduces our ability to cope with future stress. So stress definitely takes a toll on you. Now this is figure 3. You can find this at the bottom of page 467 in your book, but it asks you, how stressed are you? Find out how stressed you are by responding to the following statements below in terms of the last month only. And then you want to add up your scores. So for each of these questions, you're going to give it a number between 0 and 4. 0 meaning that it never causes stress, and 4 meaning that it very often causes stress. So you can look at this, and then there's a scoring guide at the bottom of that figure on page 467 to actually tell you how stressed you actually are. So I think that's really helpful if you want to look through that and check that out. Maybe sometimes you think you're very stressed, but you're not actually that stressed. Or maybe you think that you don't feel stressed at all, but then you take this and it turns out that you may be more stressed than what you think you are. We have a model in place on how to deal with stress, and it's called the General Adaptation Syndrome, and it's the course that stress goes through. So first off, the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS, it's a theory that was developed by Hans Seeley, and it suggests that a person's physiological response to stress consists of 3 stages. Okay, so the General Adaptation Syndrome says that there are 3 stages with stress. The first stage is alarm and mobilization. And this is where people become aware of the presence of a stressor in their life. So the sympathetic nervous system is energized. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in when you are confronted with a stressful situation. It's the fight or flight. So the alarm and mobilization is when your sympathetic nervous system is going to be generalized. The second stage is the resistance stage. This is where the stressor persists. The body actively fights that stressor. And people use a variety of means in order to cope with that. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. And then the third and final stage of this general adaptation syndrome is the exhaustion stage. And this is where you have resistance. The resistance is inadequate. Excuse me. So your ability to fight the stressor actually declines. You're not keeping up with fighting that stressor. The stressor is actually winning. So the negative consequences could be illness or psychological symptoms that occur. Here's an example of the general adaptation syndrome, and you can find this figure on page 468 in your textbook. So it shows the stressor. You got an F on a test. So the alarm immobilization is meeting and resisting that stressor. So maybe you're going to study more. You're aware of it and you need to study more. The second one is that you are actually studying more. You're spending so much time studying. And then the exhaustion stage is because you've spent so much time studying and stressing about this F, you've made yourself physically sick. You weren't able to cope with it. All right, the other part, if you remember way back to the beginning of this chapter, on the second slide, we defined psychological stress, and then we wanted to talk about psychoneuroimmunology, or the PNI, and stress. So we're going to talk about your body and your brain and how stress or how that affects stress. So psychoneuroimmunology, or PNI, is the study of the relationship between psychological factors, your immune system, and the brain. So some current or recent health psychologists specialize in PMI or PNI, and they have identified three main consequences of stress. One of those is a direct physiological result. You can see your physiological response to stress in your life. The second one is behaviors that are harmful to your health and well-being. Perhaps you started drinking because of stress. That is going to be harmful to your health and well-being. And then the third consequence is an indirect consequence of poor health-related behaviors. Now, this figure is going to go through and talk about the ones we just discussed on this previous slide, the main consequences of stress. And you can find this figure at the bottom of page 469 in your book. So the three main types of consequences that result from stress, right? The direct physiological effect, the harmful behaviors, and the indirect health-related behaviors. So direct physiological responses. You can have an increase in blood pressure. You can have a decrease in your immune system functioning, increased hormonal activity, and psychophysiological conditions. Some of the harmful behaviors that you may take up in order to deal with stress is you may increase your smoking or increase your alcohol use. You can decrease your nutrition. You're not eating regularly or not eating the right foods. Decrease sleep. Because of the stress, you're not getting enough sleep. And for some individuals, it's actually increasing their drug use. And in the indirect health-related behaviors is that you have this decreased compliance with medical advice. You have an increase in the delays in seeking medical advice, and then also a decrease in likelihood of seeking medical advice. So those are your indirect effects of stress and dealing with stress. Okay, let's talk about how you cope with stress. Whenever we talk about coping, it is the effort that you take to control, reduce, or learn to tolerate the threats that actually lead to stress. How easily are you able to cope with those everyday hassles, or with a cataclysmic event, or with a personal stressor? In emotion-focused coping, people try to manage their emotions by seeking to change the way they feel about a certain problem. For example, they can accept sympathy from others. The other type of coping besides emotion-focused coping is problem-focused coping. And this is where people attempt to modify the stressful problem or the source of stress. And these strategies lead to changes in behavior or to the development of a new plan of action in order to deal with stress. So you have two different ways of coping with stress: the emotion-focused coping or the problem-focused coping. I would think the problem-focused coping is the better way to go, because you're realizing what the stressful event is, you're dealing with it, and you're trying to change it. And so that's going to be much better than dealing with your emotions. It's not as though you can't deal with your emotions, and that's a bad thing, but how are you going to actually change it? Now, you can also have this third way of coping with stress, and that is avoidant coping. This is where you use wishful thinking or resort to more direct escape routes, such as drinking. You just want to avoid the stressful situation, and you do something else instead of dealing with it. you put up these defense mechanisms, which are your unconscious strategies that people will use to reduce anxiety by concealing the source. So you have these defenses in place that whenever a stressful situation occurs, those defense mechanisms arise so that other people don't realize what you're going through. Besides defense mechanisms, you can also have emotional insulation. And this is where the person stops experiencing emotions and therefore they remain unaffected or unmoved by both positive and negative experiences. So in this situation, they're just shutting down. They have no emotional response to it whatsoever. But by doing that, you're not dealing with the positive or the negative situation. Whenever you have defense mechanisms, you are only hiding the problem and not dealing with the reality of the situation. One thing that individuals go through is learned helplessness. They learn to be helpless, right? So learned helplessness is a state in which people conclude that unpleasant or aversive stimuli cannot be controlled. So whenever you continue to try and fix things and it doesn't work and it doesn't work, you just kind of give up and you learn that it's hopeless and it's helpless, right? So this view becomes so ingrained that the individual will cease trying to remedy the situation and that they actually have some control over the situation. They feel completely helpless, and so they just give up. So victims actually come to the conclusion that there is no link between the responses they make and the outcomes that occur. They do not see any relationship between those two. Now, when you have this learned helplessness, people experience more physical symptoms and depression when they perceive that they have no control over the situation. We have two other coping styles in place. One of those is hardiness, and the other one is resilience. So hardiness refers to it's a personality trait that is characterized by a sense of commitment, viewing problems as challenges, and having a sense of control over your life and your environment. So if you have a hardy personality, you have a sense of commitment and that you have control over what's occurring in your life. So when we talk about commitment, hardy people tend to throw themselves into what they are doing, and they have a sense that their activities are going to lead to this positive outcome. Hardy people also see challenges as more positive. And they also have the perception that they can influence the events in their lives, that they have control over what is occurring. Now, if you are someone who is resilient, that means that you don't give up. So you have this ability to withstand, overcome, and actually thrive after profound diversity occurs. So both of these, hardiness and resilience, are really great coping mechanisms that you have in place for dealing with stress. Now, the last slide in this module deals with social support. Who can you turn to when you're having a lot of stress? And you have to actually open yourself up to getting help and to actually talking to someone. So when we talk about social support, it is this mutual network of caring and you're interested in others. It enables us to experience lower levels of stress and be better able to cope with stress. So during the coronavirus, we all had this thought that we're all in this together. And this actually felt good to people, right? It wasn't just a few of us that were going through the problem of the coronavirus. We were all in it together. And you may have seen hashtag we're all in this together quite often during the coronavirus. So people in your social support network, they can provide actual physical aid in order to help you. If you're stressed because your child is sick and you have to go to work and you have to do this and that, maybe people in your social network could help out by coming to stay with your child as they are sick. Even sometimes a casual acquaintance can help in reducing stress, and that can provide a health benefit to you also.